All right, hello everyone, and welcome to our final WorldKidLit live event of September 2020, which also happens to be International Translation Day. Our first event which is available on our YouTube channel, as this event will also be, in case you want to watch it all over again, was focused on publishers of translations, and today we are foregrounding translators who come here from around the world and in many different time zones. And we're going to talk about the who, how, and why of translating literature for young readers. I'm Marcia Lynx Qualey, one of the co-founders of the WorldKidLit project, and I'm joined today by Avery Fischer Udagawa, who translates from Japanese, Laura Watkinson, who translates from Dutch, Italian, and German, Lawrence Schimel, who translates from Spanish and writes in Spanish, and Sawad Hussain, who translates from Arabic. I'm also joined, although you cannot see them, by Mohini Gupta, without whom these events would not happen, and Ruth Ahmed Zai Kemp, who is right now on the Facebook, and she will be feeding us your questions. And I just want to remind everyone that you are free to ask questions at any point. We will get to questions in the final third of this event, but you know, since you're not really raising your hand and saying the question, you may type it in at any moment. So we're going to start with each of the panelists giving a brief introduction to their work and how it relates to children's literature in translation. And we will start with the person for whom it is latest in the evening, Avery, who is coming to us from Bangkok. Avery Fischer Udagawa's translations from Japanese to English have ranged from picture books to a middle grade historical novel to an anthology of teen stories. She's also done a lot in general to boost literature for young readers in translation, including writing a weekly column for the Global Literature and Libraries Initiative website, and also serving as international and Japan translator coordinator for the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators. So Avery, if you could tell us a bit about the sort of hows and whys of your relationship to translated literature for young people. And make sure you unmute, sorry.
I totally did it and forgot to unmute. Thank you so much. This is the test call for this yesterday was my first chance to video chat with Marcia, with Laura, with Lawrence, with Sawad, with everybody involved. And I'm a fangirl of all of you and just can't believe that we get to sit and have this conversation right now. So as was just said, I translate from Japanese into English, although I live in Thailand. I grew up in Kansas in the central US and began studying Japanese as an undergraduate at St. Olaf College in Minnesota. And I also used part-time job money to fund a summer of immersion Japanese study in Bloomington, Indiana, one summer during college, which was really a pivotal time for my language acquisition and love of the language. And then after that, I was really fortunate to have funding to study in Japan in programs in Nagoya and Yokohama for about 3 years, and then got married and moved to Muscat, Oman for a couple of years, and then we've been here in Thailand for 14 years. So that was what was going on while I was gradually getting into Kidlit. I kind of debuted in this field in 2011 with this novel, J-Boys, over there. The full title is J-Boys, Kazuo's World, Tokyo, 1965. It's middle grade historical by Shogo Oketani. And my next, if we want to measure careers by long form translations, my very next novel, I just docu-signed the contract this week, will finally be coming out in summer 2021, exactly 10 years after that. I hope very much that I am now climbing out of what Anton Her calls the emerging literary translator valley of death. That's not why I wore black, but I'm just saying. In between there, I've done short stories, lots of translating about Japanese children's literature, copy for catalogs, pamphlets, newsletters. As was mentioned, I've been working on trying to increase awareness and demand for this literature seeing that there's not a lot of work in my area, particularly without government funding to kind of fuel that for my language pair. So SCBWI in particular has been wonderful about providing a way for me to network and work with colleagues to try and move the needle on how much WorldKidLit comes out in English. So I've been staying busy with that and having kids, and I also work in education at International School Bangkok. So that's
Thanks,
me in a nutshell.
Thanks so much. So next on your screen is Sawad Hussain, who was the winner of the 2019 Arab-Lit Short Story Prize and 2 English Pen Translates Awards. She co-teaches a workshop on translating Arabic comics at UK secondary schools via the collective Shadow Heroes. And her recent translations include Passage to the Plaza, which was shortlisted for the 2020 Palestine Book Awards and is a beautiful translation, and the groundbreaking experimental short fiction collection, A Bed for the King's Daughter. She also co-translated the co-written Lebanese middle grade novel Ghedi and Rawan, which was published in 2019.
And right behind you.
Sorry. I was the other co-translator. And she spoke 2 days ago on a different panel about translating Arabic children's literature. So, Sawad.
Oh, thanks so much. Sorry for interrupting. I wanted to say, like, yes, you are the other co-translator, and Ghedi and Rawan is right behind you, as it is on Avery's bookshelf, in case anyone, wasn't sure what it looked. Oh, you have the Arabic and English, so great. Yes. So, right. I have been translating for about 10 years now, going on, 11 from Arabic. I got into what I define the YA or Kidlit as like picture books, comics, and actual YA novels. And so I got into that about 5 years ago, and my first sort of dip into the pool was translating comics for Samandal, which is a Lebanese comics collective that publishes sort of kind of like anthologies. They're quite thick, their issues. Of comics from Arabic, German, French, or just written in English, and sometimes they're bilingual or en face, or just in a language other than English, on its own. And then from there, my first YA novel was with you, Marcia. Ghedi and Rawan, which is very exciting. Although I must admit, my initial motivation to translate YA novels was not for actual young readers. It was, so I was teaching Arabic I've been teaching Arabic for about 10 years as well. And it was for learners of the Arabic language, because having taught from key stage 3 up into lecturing at university of foreign learners of the Arabic language, that is really difficult for learners to jump from, the materials we have in a textbook to a novel. And there was nothing in between. And so that was my initial, motivation for wanting to translate YA novels, because they're a great learning tool for students of the Arabic language, and makes people feel very accomplished if you read an actual book. And you can have, the English alongside and also look at the Arabic structure. But then as I got more into it, I think I saw as well that this was not being done by very many people. And it was a field which I could sort of develop in. And so I've recently, my current projects, I've specialized specifically in comics and YA. I've never done any picture books. I think that's a very, translating Kidlit on its own is a very challenging sort of prospect, but I really admire people who do picture books, because it requires so much wordplay and you only have so much space. And so I recognize my limitations. And so what I wanted to say is currently with New Tree Press, we've put in an application for a grant for this Algerian YA novel, which is part crime, part historical fiction, called The Jinn's Apple by Jamila Morani. And it's set in the Abbasid period, so that's like 700 to 800 AD in an unknown place in the Middle East. And the protagonist is this gutsy 12-year-old Nardine, whose family is murdered in the first scene. I'm not giving anything away here. And so the rest of the novel is her finding her, father's killer, and her flouting like society's expectations of what she should be able to do as a female in this very sort of conservative society. It's really fun. It's a really fun novel, and I enjoyed translating the sample. So hopefully in the fall, I think maybe in October or something, we should hear if we got the grant or not. So we'll see. And then I also want to take this time to pitch to anyone who's listening a graphic novel that I'm looking for a home for. It's called, I know everyone on the panel is laughing at me because I was like, why not? This is like perfect. So it's a Lebanese graphic novel. It's called Murabba ou Laban, or in English it would be like jam, and Laban is a sort of, yogurt. It's a rough translation. And it's an biographical account of the author Lina Merhaj's German mother and her journey to Beirut, and integrating into, or how she tried to integrate into Lebanese society at the end of the 60s and the 70s. So the Civil War is the backdrop to this. And it's a wonderfully like intimate portrayal of mother-daughter relationship, but also funny. And it just, it's really, I guess a lot of people would say this about graphic novels, that, just laugh out loud, but it reminded me a bit of Persepolis in the sense that the politics of what's happening at that time is not at the forefront, but is very much like weaved throughout the novel. And it's already been translated into French and Spanish, which speaks volumes, obviously. And it won the first prize at the Algiers Comic Festival in 2013. And I am working on a sample, so if anybody's interested, please let me know. And I think it's very timely, obviously, unfortunately, with everything that's happening in Lebanon, but I think, to have a graphic novel for young readers to show, what things, how society had been before, what is it to be Lebanese, or, oh, I put a timer, sorry, because I knew I couldn't speak more than 5 minutes. So yeah, so that's about it from me, and I'm really excited to be here, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Sawad, and Sawad showing us that translation is sometimes about the hustle and taking your opportunity to pitch where you can. Next is Lawrence, who is also a co-founder of the WorldKidLit Month initiative. He is a bilingual Spanish-English writer and translator based in Madrid, Spain. He has published over 120 books as author or anthologist for readers of all ages. His books have won the Crystal Kite from SCBWI, a White Raven from the International Youth Library in Munich, and have twice been chosen for IBBY for outstanding books for young people with disabilities. His translations have won the GLIL Best Translated YA honor title and a Pen Translates Award from English Pen, among other honors. So Lawrence, tell us, why young readers?
I get exhausted just listening to that. I think I'm the only person on the panel who both writes as well as translating, at least in terms of fiction. So I'm in a slightly different position. I always used to think of myself as a writer who came to translation later, although this year, now that we're doing everything virtually, I was invited on a panel with Jenny Han for the Translating the Future series that was done out of New York. And I looked up my own bibliography, and it turns out that I published my first book in translation in 1994, which was a graphic novel by Vicente Segreyes, which was a year before my first book came out, even though that was a book under a pseudonym, came out in 1995, and my first book under my own name in 1996. So I had been writing before, publishing in anthologies and in journals, but I had actually published book-length work as a translator before publishing as a writer. My identity, though, had always been that I was a writer who, I've been living in, I'm originally from New York City. I've been living in Spain for over 20 years now. And I do write in both English and Spanish. I do translate in both directions. Most of the children's books that I've written happen to have been things that I write directly in Spanish. One of my most recent picture books is this, Que Suerte Tengo, just to show off since we have visuals available. This is basically everything a boy is jealous of his brother who happens to be blind. And one of the nicest things is that there is this spread has Braille on the spread. So anyway, that's just an exciting, diversity in a lot of levels is something I'm very interested in. So, you know, in addition to writing the books that I write, you know, just these are 2 board books. So, I mean, I do, my father liked to joke that I write books for kids and books you don't want your kids to find, because I've written a lot of erotica, very adult material. But, you know, a lot of my work deals with disability in the way of, you know, this book includes a character who happens to be disabled, but it's not about that so much. These books, girl who's trying to fall asleep, her dog wants to play, and she just happens to have 2 dads. So it's just an adventure story that just happens to include that disability element as an integral part. Very often with the translations, a lot started because, you know, since I write in both Spanish and English, I was getting asked to translate by publishers or agents or other writers to help them to sell rights and things like that. At the same time, I do a lot of pitching. I'm not quite like what Sawad did with pitching in the middle of a panel, but I mean, you have to take advantage and you have to, you know, do it when you can, to whom you can. You never know when opportunities will arise. This is one of the things that I miss the most about, because of the pandemic, we're not meeting in person at book fairs and things like that. To me, one of the most special things about book fairs is the serendipity factor. That is, you go and you have, you know, which is, you know, would have been in 2 weeks. You have meetings every half an hour. But then, you know, you'll be running between, you know, down the aisles between meetings, and you bump into someone, you know, and they're with someone and they introduce you, and 2 years later you do a book together. You know, I mean, that sort of serendipity, there's nothing like that. So in terms of the books that I do, translating into English, the 2 most recent picture books happen to be The Day Said Arrived and Some Days, one from Spain, one from Argentina. Some middle grade books I've done, The Treasure of Barracuda by a Spanish writer, and The Wild Book. This is the American and the British editions. This is a Mexican YA middle grade bibliophan. I do also translate into Spanish, some things like this, which is a book I had as a kid, Millions of Cats by Wanda Gag. And most recently was George Takei's wonderful graphic novel, They Called Us Enemy. So in a nutshell, I guess that's it for now.
Thanks so much, Lawrence. And our final panelist today is Laura Watkinson, whose translation of Annette Schaap's Lampi was the first translated book that was shortlisted for the Carnegie Medal, and also I would say is personally beloved of my children. Her other translations include Tonke Dogs, The Letter for the King, recently adapted to film by Netflix. She lives in a tall, thin house on a canal in Amsterdam with her husband and 3 cats who have not yet made an appearance, but we're not ruling it out.
Yeah, the cats might well put in an appearance at some point, so if I dash off, that's probably what's going on. It's really lovely to be here with all of you today. I think we've all been at... Translation is a bit of a solitary profession, and that's great, but I think we've probably all been a little bit lonely over the past few months, so lovely to see everyone's faces. And you know, I have quite a lot of overlap. Obviously, there's the translation thing with all of you, but just so much of what you've said already sounds so familiar to me. I mean, I share with Sawad the interest in comics. I really love translating comics. I've got 3 graphic novels lined up to translate coming up this year, so that's really exciting for me. It's been a bit of a gap with the old comics, and Avery and we've been in touch by email. I'm also a member of the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators, or SCBWI as we sometimes call it, because it's a bit of a mouthful, and we've exchanged opinions about translation and how to get more involved and so on. Lawrence, of course, also a member, and he founded the chapter in Spain of SCBWI. I founded the chapter in the Netherlands, which is now the Benelux group, and it's going great guns. So there's a little connection there between us. And Lawrence, I've said to him about this before, so it's not going to be too embarrassing. He was always a bit of a role model for me, because when I was looking at getting into translation professionally in the 1990s, every time I found a translated book that I liked the look of, it was Lawrence. And not just the translated stuff as well, you know, the science fiction connections, the fantasy connections, you know, we share that sort of interest too. So, you know, I think it's a really interesting panel to be part of. I'll just talk a little bit about my route into translation. And I guess my name's Laura and I'm a language nerd. That's where it came from. I was one of these typical kids who loved reading. Yay. And I remember distinctly, I must have been about 7, reading a kid's book, and it had a character in it who was a crazy old grandma, and she was called Oma. And I was like, why is she called Oma? Why is she not called Grandma? And, you know, that sort of set me thinking. I was like, this book was not written in English originally. This book came from somewhere else. And I found that quite exciting. I also grabbed hold of my mom's dictionary, and there was a section in the back that had all foreign words and expressions in, and I got really excited about that. And you know, I could only have been about 9, and I was writing down all these French expressions and trying to learn what they were. So it was really exciting to me when I got to learn French and German at school, and, you know, basically went on from there to study languages at university and took extra classes wherever I could. I did Esperanto classes at the University Language Center, studied Italian sort of in the background of my studies, although it wasn't one of my major languages. Did some Frisian. I did a little bit of Hebrew at the University Center as well, and I went to Jerusalem and did a summer school, and I'm still doing the same thing now. 2018, I went to Iceland and did a summer school there at the university to learn basic Icelandic, and, you know, trying to get into reading the kids' books from there. And I also went to the Faroe Islands that same summer. That was a busy old summer. And, you know, I did a language course there, of course, and I got to know some of the local children's writers. And it was great. The teacher that we had, he was really interested in kids' books. His partner worked for a children's publisher, so he actually taught us using children's books. And I was like, oh, God, these books are so exciting. You know, it's great to be able to read them. And it was such a sense of achievement to read these Faroese picture books. I was very excited about them, you can tell. And I was thinking, I must find an English publisher for these. And then it turned out that actually there already was an English publisher who had been found for them, Daft Publishers. They were translated by Marcia Thompson. I'm talking about the books of Barbara Oscarsson, which some of you might have seen, which are just so unusual and so different. And it's just so beautifully written. And as Sawad was saying before, I think picture books can be a real challenge. I think a lot of people don't realize quite how tricky they are. You know, it's like poetry. So maybe that's something that we'll get around to talking a little bit more about during the discussion. I translate across the board. I translate books for the youngest sort of readers, board books, chapter books, middle grade, young adult, and I also do books for grown-ups. It's probably, you know, a fairly even split, I'd say, but as I said, it's nice to get back into doing the comics a little bit. And German was my first major foreign language. I lived there for 4 years, and that was how I sort of started getting into translation to start with. But Dutch has taken over from that because I live in the Netherlands now. I've lived here for 17 years, and I have contacts here with the publishers. And also, I think Italian has overtaken German. I do more Italian translation. I also lived in Italy for a while. And I've recently been doing a little bit of Frisian translation on and off, which I'm really excited about. Okay, I think that's it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Laura. So then the second part is we all have sort of questions for each other that people have shared. And Laura's first question was a 3-part question, and I'm going to direct it at Avery.
But you don't have to answer all 3 parts because it's quite long.
If you forget one of the parts in the middle, that's okay, as long as you answer one of them. What was a children's or YA book that you loved as a child? What's a translated children's YA book that you love now and would recommend? And what's one of the children's YA, doesn't have to be a book, but a story or work that you translated yourself was particularly memorable or important to you for some reason?
There's a lot in there. I wanted to mention one of the first children's books that I remember loving was a picture book that my parents read to me by Udagawa, Our Best Friends. And they would read the characters' names, you know, they come in the same order. And when you read the book over and over, you learn that it's Mary, Harry, and Larry, Smudge, Doll, and Mouse, Spots, Mops, and Peeps. And they would intentionally mess up the order. They would intentionally leave someone out, and we'd be like, no, no, no. And that stuck with me all these years, as well as the wonderfully colorful illustrations by Gyo Fujikawa that include this cast of diverse characters. And this was in 1977, before that was as much of a thing now. And I think that the magic of the right picture book for the right kid with the right family at the right time is just something you never lose. I have fond memories then growing older with books like Beverly Cleary's Ramona books, which I copied a lot when I was first trying to figure out how to write. And I've been thinking about the Anne of Green Gables books recently because my kids have been dipping into them, and thinking about how, because of those books, I was this kid growing up in small town Kansas who knew about Halifax and Prince Edward Island, and that was just a normal, place to run around in my imagination, because of what I might now call WorldKidLit, although that was not in translation. And a recent read that I would definitely recommend. At the moment, I am eagerly waiting for The Beast Warrior, which is the sequel to The Beast Player, which is Kathy Hirano's translation of Kemono no Soja by Nahoko Uehashi, which has won a bunch of awards in the past year. It really does deserve all that medal on the front. And I'm still waiting for my copy of the sequel, and so I'm reading the Japanese and just loving it. I could just spend all day trying to figure out why these animals are behaving the way they are, even though I'm not typically an animal book person. It's fascinating. The animal husbandry, the full and complete world that you could just step into, the philosophical questions about how much humankind and the animal world should or shouldn't interact with each other, the fact that the main character is of mixed race, like my children, and faces prejudice about that, just all kinds of things. The Beast Player and The Beast Warrior. Whew, I'm gonna get through all these, Laura. And let's see, something that was especially meaningful to translate. I had the real privilege of working on a story called House of Trust by Sachiko Kashiwaba for the Tomo anthology, edited by Holly Thompson. Tomo, Friendship Through Fiction, an anthology of Japan teen stories. I did one story in this 36 story collection. There were 10 translations because Holly has been in solidarity with translators for years, and with authors writing in languages other than English. And she made a point of including as many as she could in this anthology, despite the fact that it came out really fast. It was a benefit project to support survivors of the Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami of March 2011 and ensuing nuclear disasters. And it was published a year later. And that was with lots of people going to work really fast. So that was when I had a baby that I was working on my story. It was my second baby, but my mother remembers caring for the baby a lot, and some of the times when that story needed to be worked on. But because Kashiwaba, Ms. Kashiwaba, the author of the story I was working on, is from Iwate Prefecture, which was deeply impacted by the disasters of March 2011, she was really keen to be involved in this. And when it was launched in Boston, I was unable to go, but she flew there with her daughter from Iwate Prefecture. And this is from Japan to the East Coast, is one of those really just, journeys. And they went in kimono, tied in styles that come up in the story, that are part of the story, and showed up at this event. And perhaps because it was a benefit project, but honestly, I think it was because international kidlit people are just so great. They're in it for all the right reasons. And with this being a real heart project for so many, we exchanged stories, we critiqued each other for that project. A friend of mine showed up in Boston to help her to help Ms. Kashiwaba in Japanese, since I couldn't be there, and Holly was looking after her, and everybody involved just did so much to make the book the best it could be, so that it could do as much as it could for the people who had gone through just the unspeakable. And so that was an incredibly meaningful project.
Thank you so much, Avery. So a question from Sawad, which I'm going to direct at Lawrence, which was about, because I think you would know this, Lawrence, how the Spanish language market for children's literature compares to the English when you're translating or writing in different directions. So she had said that Anton Her, who translates from Korean to English, had said that sales of YA in Korean are much larger than sales of adult literature. I don't know if he said much, but larger than adult literary fiction. And I'm sure that Sawad and I would both say that, say in Arabic, that the children's market is smaller than it's, even though there's great things happening, the market itself is smaller. And so how does the Spanish language market differ in terms of its importance, its size for literature for young people? You're on mute, Lawrence.
Unmute. Okay. One of the things that's difficult when talking about literature for young people is basically it's a category that goes from birth until 18. And now that we have what's called new adult, especially because the YA market was so powerful and it sort of crossed over to what they call this new adult. And that happened because it was driving English language publishing for just as such a powerful force. But I think it's difficult to, picture books works differently than middle grade and young adult. So I think that we would need to split those out. And I think also that when it comes to translation, both of those work differently. In general, I think that the Spanish, you have two things that happen. You have some really excellent books that are written in Spanish, but the market tends to be very dominated by foreign books. It's a very strong market. One of the things that happens, you have independent publishers who do a lot of really innovative stuff that in English are themes that often are considered to be too taboo to deal with in the English language market. But at the same time, because picture books are so expensive to print, very often Spanish publishers will just, join a co-edition of a French book by Rebecca Dautier or Benjamin Lacombe, or they'll, an American or a British, very popular modern picture book. And as a result, those foreign books tend to dominate very strongly the market. The same is actually true with a lot of it's sort of the Harry Potter phenomenon. So foreign YA with Harry Potter became a huge industry all around the world. And as a result, you have some Spanish writers who are writing stuff in that vein. Spanish publishers also, that there's a large tradition in Spain of competitions, including for young adults, some of which have very large purses. And so it's one of the biggest differences, I think, between the English world and the Spanish world, is that most prizes in Spain are competitions to be published, whereas in the English-speaking world, most prizes are for work that already has been published. The other big thing that's a difference between the two is that, like if I translate a book, something like The Treasure of Barracuda, which won the Barco de Vapor Prize for Best YA in Spain. This book, for instance, in the Spanish edition is in its 53rd edition in 4 or 5 years. I mean, it's just been a huge success. In the US, though, this got scaled down to middle grade. So, I mean, the age, it doesn't always map exactly between the Anglophone and the Spanish world. Also, what themes that are considered to be acceptable to discuss, the Spanish language originals get into things much, much earlier and address things much more openly, I think, than a lot of the English counterparts.
Yeah, I think that's probably true of a lot of our languages. I have a book coming out next month that won a big YA prize in Arabic, and it's being published in English as as for adults, because everyone said, this isn't a YA novel, this is for grown-ups. Oh, okay. So Avery's question, I'm going to turn on to Laura. And Avery was asking, so I think it will pair it with many of the questions that are coming in about advice for translators. So Avery was asking, what will it take for translators of children's literature into English to be credited on the covers of books and receive copyright to their translations? And is there sort of less respect? Are children's translators of children's literature sort of hidden more? And how can we, is it important to foreground translators of literature for young people more?
I don't think it's particularly an issue that involves just children's translators. I think it's across the board. Avery's absolutely right. It's quite rare to see your name on the cover of a book as a translator. The copyright issue, I would say, in my experience, is more of a problem with, say, educational publishers in the US. It's not something that I've encountered too much. Most US publishers are great about allowing you to have the copyright. I mean, not taking your copyright away, because that copyright is our right as translators. It's creative work. And the UK, they're pretty good. Sometimes you do encounter a contract that will expect you to do work for hire. I always say no. Can we talk about this? But it doesn't seem to come up too often. But yeah, that issue about getting the name on the cover and, you know, people remembering in reviews to credit the translator, it is a problem. And I think I've generally encountered among writers, they have a lot of respect for what we do. They do appreciate the creativity that goes into creating a translation, and they do see us as co-creators of that translated work. In certain other areas of the publishing industry, and perhaps among some readers, it's more difficult to gain that sort of credit, to see that you have a right to be on the front of the book, to be remembered all the time. And I think what would be wonderful would be if we could get more people in the publishing industry to come along to translation workshops, and they could see exactly what we do when we're translating. Because, you know, I'm sure we've all been in translation workshops, but, you know, it's a sort of closed shop. We're all translators, we're all talking to each other. We know you get 10 people in a translation workshop, you will get 10 very different translations, all taking different angles. You know, it is not the case, as I have heard people say, that the text is there in the original language, and if you get 10 translators, they'll all come up with the same text. It's not, you know, it's not typing. There's a hell of a lot goes on up here. We're thinking about things all the time. That is our work. Yeah. So we need to raise awareness of that. And we need to remember that when we're talking to people, we stress our creativity. We remind them that the copyright is ours. We say, please credit me. You know, I deserve that credit, as well as the author, as well as the illustrator. And I always try to remember to credit the publisher as well when I'm talking about books that I've translated. So it's nice when that's reciprocated.
Great, thanks so much, Laura. So a question from Avery then to Sawad. So what do you think would help increase the demand for WorldKidLit in the English reading world, and how would English reading world look or feel or be different if there was more translated literature for young people on the shelves?
So just to confirm, WorldKidLit, we're meaning like in translation, right?
Yeah.
Okay. I think first of all, the initiative that was started by, I think, yourself and Ruth Ahmedzai Kemp about, and I'm forgetting the third person's name, I'm really sorry, about WorldKidLit Month is a wonderful initiative, like, to get even just having these talks and get people interested in WorldKidLit. So that's a wonderful start. I think the key place it needs to happen is in schools. I think there needs to be, some sort of support given to teachers with, like, if you want to, for example, bring a graphic novel into the classroom or something like Gladien or Rwan, to just have like questions that go along with that, or, you know, maybe an interview with the author, some multimedia, you know, that goes along so that it can become a sort of lesson, in the sense like it's a book that can be read during class and then there can be like discussion about it, rather than it just sitting in the library. I think it's wonderful to have reading lists in the library, but obviously some kids need to be pushed a bit to try out new books and the like. And I think if you could just have like a whole year of reading books from around the world in each, like, you know, grade, that would be wonderful. And having been a teacher, if I had, you know, resources already at my fingertips, I'd be much more likely to incorporate that sort of stuff into my classroom, instead of having to, you know, read the book myself and prepare a lesson plan for it and everything. So I think that's sort of an area that could be developed by, you know, either translators who have done the book or other people who are interested in promoting WorldKidLit. And I think it's really important, I know this wasn't part of the question, but I meant to say it in my introduction and I forgot, that obviously, and it has been said many times before, but I don't think it hurts to say it again, that it is really important for children to see themselves in literature. I grew up in different places around the world, but what's interesting is, like Avery was saying, I also grew up with Ramona and like Encyclopedia Brown and Sweet Valley High. And I didn't realize until later what impact that had on me, which, you know, I loved those books, but there also was like a negative sort of impact that it had on me as a teenager in terms of what sort of, maybe, for example, ideals of beauty I was aspiring to, even though there were no pictures in that book, in those books, you know, like Sweet Valley High, etc. It's just the whole sort of concept. So,
if I could just mention one thing here, just tied into that, with especially, this is what happens with picture books, and this is one of the big problems with the globalization, that it's much cheaper for publishers to just add on. I mean, to print 1,000 copies on their own would be X per book. So this, I'm a terrible artist, but can people guess what that is?
yeah, I know, because I've seen this, but
It's
I
a
won't.
mailbox.
It's a mailbox, but kids in Spain know this is a mailbox, even though mailboxes in Spain do not look like this at all. I mean, it's the same thing with the yellow and black taxis from New York. So many kids in other parts of the world, I mean, here in Spain, a taxi is, they're white, they're not yellow and black, but they recognize the yellow and black taxi as a taxi, because there are so many American picture books that have those, that then, you know, get exported, like what Sawad was saying, you know, that so many kids around the world normalize to power dynamics. You know, certain cultures or countries are considered universal, whereas others are considered niche or local or something. Sorry to jump in, but you know, that was just something.
No, that's totally fine. And I think in some aspects it can be a positive thing, right? That we know more about each other's cultures and stuff. But I think when it gets to the point where you're only seeing one particular view of the world, and then you know, put that on yourself, then I think that's where it becomes a bit dangerous. And I think the second part of the question was, it what would the world look like with more WorldKidLit? Just like a better place, obviously. Yeah, I think, and there would be like more people interested also in learning different languages. I think, you know, having WorldKidLit in, you know, whether it's in your own language, so whether it's in English or Urdu or Arabic, you know, that's great that there's all this, like, you know, cross sort of, not pollination, but crossing of, you know, ideas and books. But more importantly, I think it should lead, you know, which is a bit idealistic, obviously, to like, you know, better understanding and, you know, world peace and all of that. But I don't see anything negative in having more WorldKidLit. I mean, it can only lead to better things. And I think any translator of WorldKidLit would agree. So, yeah.
And I think any translator of WorldKidLit should also be reading kids' literature. That's a really important thing.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so Mohini is telling me now it is time to move on to the questions.
Woo!
And so speaking of what somebody who's aspiring to translate literature for young people should do, I'm going to direct this at Laura. Ana Luz, Isabella, and Christina are asking, how do you get started in translation? How do you pitch book publishers if you're just starting out? I'd like to know more about how to do book samples, particularly for children's literature, and how that's different from pitching literature for adults.
That's a whole lot of stuff right there. Yeah. like I say, my first tip would be to read, to keep on reading, to make sure that you're not just translating children's literature, you are reading children's literature. You know, it's something that you're enthusiastic about yourself as a reader, and you know the sort of books that you like to read and the sort of books that you like to translate. I recently translated a series of YA thrillers by Myron Stoffels for Delacorte Press in the US, and they're really, really exciting books. And they're the kind of books that I would choose to read myself. You know, I read I read across the range, but you know, these are books that I would have picked off the shelf and I would have read myself, whether or not. The first one's just come out recently, so it's called Escape Room. Keep an eye out for that one. And you know, I'm reading right now this book. It's called Even If We Break. It's by Marieke Nijkamp. She is Dutch, but she writes in English, in American English, and she's published in the States. And she's written some really exciting books. And, you know, it's nice to me to read that book and to see the similarities with these thrillers that I've recently translated, and to sort of keep my mind in that setting. So yeah, reading and talking to people. You know, we all talk to each other. I think networking is hugely important. You know, I know what sort of books other translators might be interested in, and if I'm talking to a publisher, I might think, I know somebody who would be interested in doing that. And, you know, we pass work on to each other. Lawrence has passed work on to me. I recommended him to a publisher. You know, that there is that cross-pollinations coming back up again. And Lawrence mentioned earlier book fairs. Lawrence quite often has appointments with publishers. You know, he's much more into not just the translating and the writing, but also publishing. So he has formal appointments. If I go to a book fair, I tend to just do it in a very informal way, and I will walk around and I'll bump into people like Lawrence and publishers that I've worked with. Quite a lot of the Dutch publishers that I work with in the Netherlands, I don't see here, or I rarely see them here, but I will go to the book fair, the children's book fair in Bologna, and I'll bump into them there, and we'll go for a coffee or go for an ice cream or something like that. So, you know, just keeping those little relationships going, that's important. As for pitching, I'm probably not the best person to talk to about this. I'm very lucky because when I got into translation, it was firstly through Dutch, and we have a very good literature foundation in the Netherlands, and also in Flanders, where they speak Dutch too. And they have funding available for samples. So, you know, I did quite a few samples for them and translated brochures and so on. So that got me onto publishers' desks. I got there with their help. And then I started to build up a sort of back catalogue of books that I published, that I translated and had been published. So people started coming to me, which was delightful. Maybe somebody else could talk about, you know, is there anything that you really wanted to pitch, a passion project? I do pitch things if I know that a publisher that I work with would definitely like this book. So, you know, but then it's a very sort of informal thing.
What about you, Avery? Do you have any sort of advice for somebody who's wanting to enter into the process of becoming a translator for young readers? How they get involved, how they pitch?
You will want to get involved with, in my experience, professional organizations and conferences and fairs that have to do with the language, the publication world that the language and publication world that you're looking at. For me, I translate into English, especially with the US in mind. So I was drawn quite early to SCBWI because it was founded and is still headquartered in the US, and it now does far more than just looking at US publishing, but I could find a lot of expertise there. People who are also interested in getting started and getting published there. I could go to conferences and hear editors talk about what they were looking for and how to pitch to them, and I could get pointed to submission guidelines and start making those valuable connections with people. I interviewed Laura years ago and she told me network, network, network.
I'm still saying the same thing.
Because this is a fundamentally collaborative thing a translator does, right? You have to have a connection with somebody else to be able to bring an author's work to a new audience. So it's really hard to do that professional development on your own. And I have just found that joining relevant professional groups, and not just joining and seeing what you can learn and take away, but also seeing how you can contribute, because then that starts some really organic reciprocal relationships, is a good way. And it takes a while, but eventually it starts to take, and people start to think of you for projects, or, you know, ask you about work. And you can find out, okay, if I want to do some samples, where do I take them? How do I get them looked at? Have these been critiqued enough? Stuff like that.
But also get in touch with the publishers in the source language, because they often have material that they want translating, like brochures or little short samples. And then, you know, if that publisher meets with an English publisher or your target language publisher at the book fair, your name might well come up.
You have to be a detective about the source market, the target market, and all the stuff that goes on in between.
Yeah.
One of the best things, I think, also, it's important to get in touch with the source publisher, because you have to find out who actually controls the rights.
Right.
You know, you might be passionate about a book, but it may have already been sold, or, you know, I mean, so the first step is generally to either get in touch with the author or the publisher to make sure that those rights are available. Sometimes those publishers will commission a sample. Sometimes they've already commissioned a sample. You know, but that relationship, you know, you can either pitch, having done the sample, you can pitch to the English language market, or you can talk to the source language market and get them to commission as well. The same is true, like what Laura and Avery was saying about working with other translators and other professionals. A lot of things will come from people in your same language combination in the other direction. So a lot of people don't do both directions the way I do. So a lot of times other translators who do English into Spanish will be like, someone needs Spanish into English, would you be interested? And, you know, so making those network connections, I think, is an important.
Yeah, and as for length of sample, I mean, I always aim to do the typical writer's submission, which would be the first 20 pages of the book. You know, I think if you can't grab a publisher with the first 20 pages, then it's probably not going to work. I wouldn't go about translating the whole book. 20 pages would be my maximum, I think, particularly if you're not getting paid.
So David Jacobson is asking, would it, I'm going to direct this at Lawrence, would it help spread translation of children's literature in English if there were more competitions for writers or translators before publication?
I don't know so much that you know, probably more than competitions for writers, I would say if there was more active support from the few supporting institutions. I mean, like, one of the things that's really nice, English Pen, which has the Pen Translates Award. This is a children's poetry book that I translated that they gave an award to, and they just gave an award also to a Slovenian picture book that Olivia Hubel translated for Tiny Owl. So they are one of the few non-country specific bodies that provides translation support. Sawad has had two books that were supported from them as well, I believe. And you know, so the fact that they are actively also encouraging translations of work for younger readers, that kind of thing is especially important. A lot of the national funding bodies, some of them do include books in what they will fund, and others absolutely categorically do not. And so, you know, that sort of translation support, more than competitions, I think, you know, most of the competitions, it would be great to have competitions for translators as well. But I think in terms of getting the publishing industry to more actively publish more translations, that sort of actual hard cash to say, you know, do this, that I think would be have a much bigger impact.
And so Borders Book Reviews asks, and I'm going to direct this at Sawad, because she's the one who started this, was why are picture books particularly difficult to translate?
Yes. So I have done one, but it was more so on spec. So it was for the Emirates Literature Festival. It was called, I think the title was Luqaymat, which in the Emirates is like a very specific sort of delicacy. It's like fried dough balls. What ended up happening is, you know, they liked my translation, but I think someone else was already translating at the same time, and the people who had asked me to do this, the spec trans didn't realize that. So in any case, you know, they went with their translation. But translating that book took me like, it was only like, I don't know, 12 pages. It took me, you know, triple the time of, you know, 12 pages full of like the most difficult prose I've done for like an adult book. I mean, it was just, you have to consider like rhyme, you know, how much space you have on the page. In Arabic, the picture books tend to be quite wordy, as Marcia knows, and then, you know, making it into concise English, and then also dealing with like cultural differences, which, you know, usually in adult literature you can get around with a stealth gloss, or like, you know, some other contextual sort of aid, but you can't change the pictures in a picture book. And so, yeah, Lawrence is like, no, you can't. Yeah, so that's why I really, after just going through that one exercise, I realized that if I ever were to do a picture book, I would, you know, do it co-translation, because I find that, you know, the skill set that I can offer is only so much, is limited. And also I find you need to be, as, you know, Laura was saying, and which is the case, whatever you're translating, you need to be reading a lot of that specific sort of literature. And admittedly, I don't read a lot of picture books. You know, I think I will be, well, I am now. I've just, you know, I have a son who's 2 months old now, so we've already started reading more picture books, but I read mostly YA and adult literature. So I think that's why it's so difficult, is also with picture books, is like you're going for two audiences. It's not just the child, but it's also the adult who's reading to the child at that time.
You've got to be aware of being able to read it out loud as well. I mean, that's one of the things that you need to remember. Will this book read it out loud? Mm-hmm.
So the cadence and how the words fall are just so much more important.
Right.
So it's not just like, you know, comics where, you know, I'm used to comics, you only have like a certain amount of space on the page, but you're not so worried about how much it sounds out loud. Like, yes, you know, you want it to sound good, but it's not as key, because part of your audience might not even be seeing the picture. Like sometimes when adults are reading to young kids, you know, the book is towards me and I'm reading to you. Although, you know, technically I should be showing you the pictures, but it doesn't always work out like that. So how it sounds is really key. And so that's why I really admire people who do picture books. So I hope that answers the question.
Yes. So final question, because we are coming to the end. It's from Laura, so I'm going to direct it out at Laura. How can a translator keep up with children's and YA interests and with what they're looking for in reading?
Just keep reading. That's all I'd say. Read, read, read. I said network, network, network. Read, read, read. I don't really struggle to keep up with children's and YA reading, because it's a major part of what I read. It's part of my DNA. I've always kept on reading children and YA books, and, you know, just get more recommendations, and, you know, have a look at what the publishers are coming out with, have a look at their brochures, get to know the market a little bit, and find the authors that you enjoy reading, and then, you know, look for equivalents in the language that you want to translate from. It's like, I grew up with some wonderful fantasy books. We've got some great British fantasy writers, and I remember my favorite book when I was little was A Little White Horse by Elizabeth Goudge. I adored that book. I read it inside out. And now, like Lampy by Annette Schaap, that I've been able to translate recently, which is coming out in America as Off Sultan's Shore by Charles Bridge Publishers, that has that same sort of magic feeling to it. And, you know, that's why Pushkin Press decided to go for that book. But I was able to be enthusiastic about it because that's the kind of book that I like reading. So just go with your interests, follow your interests.
And read widely, both in the language that you're translating into, as well as what you're translating out of. Many years ago, I worked at the children's bookstore, Books of Wonder, and my first day on the job, actually, they sat me down with a stack of 50 current or classic picture books that the store loved. And I had to read all of those picture books so that I would be able to hand sell books to people when they came in, you know, so that I was familiar with lots of books to be able to recommend on a wide range of, you know, subjects, characters, everything like that. But, you know, the first thing that they had me do was to spend the first day just reading and getting up to speed on, you know, the other staff favorites from my colleagues.
Excellent. So Mohini is telling me that it is time, and that I should mention again that it's International Translation Day. And thank you so much to the panelists who joined us here today. Thanks also to everyone in the audience who helped us spread the word about World Kidlit Month, about literature and translation for young readers and its importance. And we will hopefully have more of these events, not only in this month, but spaced a little bit throughout the year. And you can find us at WorldKidLit on Twitter, at worldkidlit.wordpress.com, and just generally everywhere. So thanks again, everyone, panelists, audience.
Thank you, Marcia.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Gracias.
Bye.
Bye.